Chapter 9 Palace of Solitude. Fear not, my lord. That power that made you king hath power to keep you king in spite of all. Shakespeare, King Richard II. Act 3, Point 2, verse 27 to 28. In 1950, the Shah's political and private life experienced drastic changes. His wandering bachelor days came to an end, and his political life became dominated by oil. Iranian politics in the second half of the 40s had become increasingly overshadowed by the question of oil and the country's attempt to wrest its increasingly valuable oil industry away from British monopoly control. The intransigence of the British and their inability to see the depth of the sentiment for this cause only made the Shah's life more complicated. The wave of nationalism that swept the countries of the Third World in the aftermath of World War II helped Iranian nationalists. By 1950, in spite of the role many different individuals had played in the oil saga, Mohammad Mossadegh was the undoubted leader and symbol of Iran's quest to nationalize its oil. At the same time, the Shah, having just pushed through an amendment to the Constitution increasing his power, riding a wave of pro-royalist sentiments after surviving an assassination attempt, and thinking that he had finally rid himself of the troublesome Khavam, was working fast behind the scenes to increase his hold on power. He had by then launched the Senate mandated in the 1905 Constitution, but not materialized until 1949. His parliamentary power increased as the law allowed him to name 30 of the 60 senators. It is his first years on the throne. Britain and the United States had advised him to remain a constitutional monarch, but now, with the rise of nationalist and communist sentiments in Iran, both countries wanted and encouraged the Shah to be more forceful. In the ebb and flow of the time's unstable political situation, 5 prime ministers in a 2-year parliamentary term, the Shah tried to carve out for himself an indispensable unique role. The Cold War was in full force, and the Shah tried to position himself as the last bastion against the communist threat in Iran. By August 1953, the increasing power of the Tudeh Party, the death of Stalin, the Soviet Union's muscular policy in Eastern Europe, the victory of Mao Zedong in China, the Korean War, and the beginning of the anti-colonial wars in Southeast Asia, all inadvertently helped the Shah. As documents from the U.S. and British archives show, both countries concluded as early as March 1951 that the Shah was the West's best hope in fighting the communist threat in Iran. In a directive to the U.S. Embassy in Tehran at the time, for example, Secretary of State Dean Acheson stated that the only person who could provide the requisite leadership under the current circumstances is the Shah, and we believe that the U.S. and Britain should support him in every feasible way. It was in this spirit that Acheson noted that it was of vital importance to make clear that any aid by the United States was given to the Shah and the Iranian people, not Mossadegh. At the same time, at least in the State Department, there was also a small faction insisting that the best way to stop the communists in Iran was not to support the Shah, but to go all out in support of Mossadegh. Early in 1953, this faction was still arguing against an attempt to topple Mossadegh. Instead, they suggested that the United States should give him sufficient assistance to stand up to the Tudeh party. That group lost the argument, at least partially as a result of Mossadegh's occasional efforts to frighten the United States by flirting with the Tudeh or even the Soviet Union. The rise of John Foster Dulles and his brother Alan to the top of the American foreign policy establishment and their distrust of nationalists as bulwarks against communism also played a key role in defeating the strategy of the pro-Mossadegh faction in the State Department. But the most important reason for the group's failure was the success of the British government in portraying them as naive and their ideas as silly. The more Mossadegh lost his viability as a bastion against communism, the more the Shah benefited. In domestic politics, too, the Shah was looking for an alliance with all opponents of communism. He even tried to find some allies among some of Mossadegh's supporters, Social Democrats who had initially joined the Tudeh party in the mistaken assumption that it was an independent voice for change and justice, and Democrats who had joined the National Front in the belief that it was the voice of Iranian democracy. These two disgruntled groups had joined forces to form what they called the Toilers' Party. Mozaffar Baghai, a powerful orator, a professor of political philosophy at Tehran University, and one of the most influential leaders of the oil nationalization movement, and Khalil Maliki, an estranged leader of the Tudeh party, and one of Iran's most dedicated and erudite social democrats, were the most eminent leaders of this party. Before the party split in two, with Baghai leading one faction and Maliki the other, the Toilers' Party was the most formidable adversary and challenger of the Tudeh party. Another key element of the Toilers' party's political platform was support for Mossadegh and the effort to nationalize Iran's oil. In the months before August 1953, Baghai broke with Mossadegh and became one of his chief critics, while Maliki, though critical of some of Mossadegh's tactics, remained loyal to him. During this period, the Shah tried to monitor closely the work of leftist groups through the military intelligence unit, Rokni-Do. Pakrovan was in charge of that unit and a close ally of the Shah. He was also a member of a highly covert network of officers loyal to the Shah and opposed to the communists. Membership was by invitation only and was solemnized during secret rituals reminiscent of Masonic rites. This network became increasingly important in the Shah's effort to maintain control of the army during the heady days of confrontation with Mossadegh. While fighting communism was high on the Shah's mind, Iran was bedazzled by Mossadegh's nationalization movement and his battle with the British. The American government, aware of Mossadegh's rising appeal and the tide of nationalism sweeping the world, tried to convince the British to make some grand gesture of conciliation, some indication that they recognized the legitimacy and power of the movement. After much intransigence, the British finally agreed to start negotiations for a new oil agreement with Iran. But as British archival documents clearly show, their strategy from the onset was to pay lip service to the nationalist movement while maintaining their control of Iran's oil. A note by Dean Acheson, written in November 1951, offers a remarkably clear view of the British government's vision of Iran. He writes of Churchill roaring like a wounded lion, and of the British government's truculent braggadocio. He argues that the cardinal point of British policy is not to prevent Iran from going commie, but to preserve what they believe to be the last remaining bulwark of British solvency. He writes of the decline of the British Empire and of Britain's unwillingness to accept anything but Mossadegh's defeat. The British even refused to allow Iran to examine the oil company's books, claiming such examination would threaten their national security. Nevertheless, the British needed to appear willing to negotiate. Thus, beginning in 1948 and again in 1949, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, AIOC, later renamed British Petroleum, or BP, sent a representative named Neville Gass to renegotiate the terms of the company's agreement with Iran. But then, AIOC was principally owned by the British government because the Admiralty bought 85% of its energy from the company at discount prices. Gass's interlocutor in Iran was a career politician named Abbasghali Golshayan, who never survived the taint of what came to be known as the Gas-Golshayan or Supplemental Oil Agreement. According to the Supplemental Oil Agreement signed on the 27th of July 1949, Iran's actual revenue for each barrel of oil would have gone from 22 cents per barrel to 33 cents per barrel. Britain heralded it as a new beginning for Iran, a fairer agreement than any oil-producing nation of the world had ever been afforded before. This was hardly the case. By then, Mexico had nationalized its oil, and the United States had offered Venezuela a 50-50 profit-sharing agreement and was about to do the same with Saudi Arabia. Mossadegh, by then in charge of a key Majlis committee with oversight over all oil negotiations, took up the mantle of defeating the supplemental agreement, calling it a betrayal of Iran's sovereign rights. The Shah's position on the supplemental agreement was at best inconsistent. In fact, there were clear discrepancies between his public pronouncements and what he told the British embassy in private. The British were pressuring the Shah to use his influence to help ratify the agreement. The Shah was in those days planning his first visit to the United States and to Europe, and the British embassy in Tehran tried to convince him to cancel his trip in order to attend to the task of getting the agreement ratified. On more than one occasion, the Shah assured the British privately that he was in favor of the supplemental agreement and was doing everything in his power to help get it ratified. But he also warned that, given Mossadegh's opposition and the national mood, its passage was unlikely. As the pressure to cancel his trip increased, the Shah told British officials that he had asked Mohammed Saeed, then the Prime Minister, to remain in office until he had secured the ratification of the supplemental oil agreement. But neither Saeed nor anyone else could muster the votes in the Majlis for the passage of such an agreement. Few politicians, and certainly not the Shah, dared offer public support for it. When the supplemental oil agreement was submitted to the Majlis on December 19, 1949, the Oil Commission, chaired by Mossadegh, unanimously rejected it. The British embassy, angry at the outcome, complained bitterly of the Shah's inability to deliver on his promise to help pass the bill. It is generally felt he might be either a naive, sorry, it is generally felt he must be either a knave or a fool, or both. The Shah was neither. He was a pragmatic politician, keen on retaining his power and keeping his options open. He knew public support for the supplemental agreement was the kiss of political death. He knew that Mossadegh was the man of the hour and that nationalization of oil was the most popular and dominant demand of the movement. More than once, he publicly declared his undivided support for the nationalization movement. Anyone who opposed the movement or its leader, the Shah knew, did so at great peril. He also knew that the British might do to him should he part policy with them, and he also knew what the British might do to him should he part policy with them, and he knew that Mossadegh was no friend of the Pahlavi dynasty. The politician, the political, wow, having some trouble here. The political horizon looked bleak for the Shah. He could seize absolute power, dissolve the Majlis, and arrive at some kind of agreement that paid lip service to nationalization, but in fact perpetuated British control of Iranian oil by agreeing to some disguised form of the supplemental agreement. He had neither the temperament nor the public support for such an aggressive move. He also knew the United States would be opposed to this idea. During his November 1950 trip to the United States, the Shah met with President Truman and addressed a joint session of Congress. In the course of his negotiations with Truman's administration officials, including the President, the Shah learned that the United States favored a more equitable deal for Iran in its negotiations with the AIOC. By the end of his trip, he was convinced that the Truman administration had concluded that nationalization of Iran's oil was a foregone conclusion, and that Britain should learn to live with it. The American government had further concluded that it was not in the interest of the West as a whole for the United States to be identified with any plan put forth by the British which did not recognize the principle of nationalization. More than once during those months, the Truman administration nearly resolved to publicly break with Britain and side with the Iranian nationalists. By late in 1951, Churchill came back into power and made Truman understand in no uncertain terms that Britain's continued support in the Korean War was predicated on America's help in Iran. The Shah's second alternative was to accept Mossadegh and nationalization and resign himself to a merely ceremonial role. As he had repeatedly said, he never took this option seriously as he was unwilling to accept the role of a ceremonial leader. He also knew cooperating with Mossadegh meant a direct confrontation with Britain. By the end of 1952, the Shah had learned that even the Truman administration had lost patience with Mossadegh, making this second option even less appealing. His third alternative was to accept as prime minister a charismatic politician who could stand up to Mossadegh and solve the oil crisis. He disliked that option, knowing full well that it was precisely as a charismatic prime minister that his father had ascended the throne and overthrown the old Qajar dynasty. As the British waited anxiously for the Shah to find a solution to the oil question, a number of Iranian politicians contacted the British embassy or government and suggested that they were ready and able to solve the oil problem in a manner favorable to the British. On December 10, 1950, Saeed Zia had met with officials of the British embassy and complained about the inference of the royal family, particularly Princess Ashraf in public affairs. He went on to say that activities of the Shah had reached a stage where they threatened the dynasty. He even claimed that there was now a good deal of talk about a republic, and that Kavem was soon going to announce his plans to create such a republic. On December 17, 1950, Zia had lunch with the British ambassador again, and this time told him that the Shah was an utter failure and had failed in everything he had undertaken. He also made it clear that he himself was ready to take office whenever the moment was convenient, and then went so far as to say that if the British government were interested in hearing details of a plan, he would be very glad to impart them. Almost a year later, it was Kavem's turn to contact the British and indicate that he too was ready to take office and to dissolve the Majlis and arrange an election of a new one sympathetic to the British interest, and press for a modified agreement with the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. In November 1951, he threw all caution to the wind and met directly with the British ambassador, saying that he hoped that, sincerely assisted by the British, he could come to power. 3 months later, on February 7th, 1952, in a meeting with Julian Amery, a high-ranking British diplomat, he laid out his detailed plans. The meeting took place in Paris, where Kavem was visiting, and much to Amery's surprise, Kavem had also invited Captain David Drummond, a.k.a. Prince Hamid Qajar, the man who in 1941 had been rejected as a candidate to replace the Shah only because he spoke no Persian. Kavem made no effort to hide his disdain for the Shah and the fact that he preferred Drummond Qajar as a king. Kavem's plans to come back to power faced two obstacles. The Shah was adamantly opposed to his appointment, and the British were still not ready to abandon the Shah in favor of a man they considered the master of the double cross. In a later meeting, Kavem informed the British embassy that the time to act was now, and that he was made anxious by report that there were frequent contacts between Mossadegh and the Russian embassy. During these months, Kavem, according to a British embassy report, was receiving financial aid and support from none other than the Shah's mother, who also worried about what she considered her son's weakness and indecision. What a bitch. Even the Shah's siblings were not free of the temptation to enter the fray. As early as February 1950, Ali Reza, the Shah's only full brother, met with British officials to register his approval of the supplemental agreement and his dismay at the Shah's handling of the matter. A few months later, he became even more critical and ambitious. On December 13, 1951, Ali Reza called the British ambassador to his palace and bitterly complained that he was allowed to take no part in the affairs of the state whatsoever by his brother. The fact that he was the Shah's only full brother, and the fact that the powerful Queen Mother was very anxious for him to be made crown prince, made these comments even more significant. British officials were struck by the bitterness mixed with contempt with which Ali Reza spoke of his brother. A few months later, the prince again asked to see the British ambassador, and he went even further in criticizing the Shah. He made it quite clear that in his opinion the Shah did not have the necessary strength of character to uproot the corrupt ruling class and bring about necessary fundamental reforms. Instead of deposing the Shah at the time, to make a change at the critical moment would be dangerous. Ali Reza said he recommended that he be named commander-in-chief. About the same time, one of the Shah's half-brothers, Abdul Reza, had met with the American ambassador and suggested that he be put in charge of the country's economic situation. Even Sardar Fakhr Hekmat, for many years Speaker of the Majlis and an ally of the Shah, complained to the British Embassy in 1951 about the Shah's inaction and indecision, and how Hekmat's words of warning seemed merely to bounce off the thick head of the king, as he himself put it. Hekmat wanted the British government to make it clear to the Shah that unless he behaves in a more manly and decisive manner, there would be no chance to save his throne. As the Shah contended with these forces, Britain and the United States preferred the appointment of a powerful prime minister to take on Mossadegh. For both countries, Iran was too important to allow the Shah's private trepidations to become an insurmountable obstacle to that option. The Shah tried to buy himself some time by appointing loyal caretaker prime ministers. On each occasion, he would assure the British Embassy that he had instructed the Prime Minister to get the supplemental agreement passed. It was no surprise that none of his chosen Prime Ministers succeeded in passing the agreement, and thus on June 26, 1950, the Shah had no choice but to agree to the appointment of General Haj Ali Razmara as the new Prime Minister. By then, Razmara was in his third term as chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Only weeks earlier, the Shah had declared that he would never agree to General Razmara becoming the Prime Minister. He knew that the British had earlier had serious reservations about Razmara. In 1949, for example, they had described him as probably the most feared and disliked man in Persia today. They called him a corrupt, ambitious intriguer who trims his sail to any wind. They also reported on rumors of his pro-Soviet inclination. But by June 1950, Razmara realized his hour had arrived. In a series of meetings with the British and American officials, he promised to bring about both political reforms in the country and the resolution of the oil crisis by helping pass a revised agreement that was within the existing formula. He demanded that both embassies pressure the Shah to come out publicly in support of him. He also wanted the British Embassy to tell Ayatollah Abul Qasim Kashani, a powerful Shiite cleric and a leader of the nationalization movement, that the cleric would not have British support in opposing him. Finally, the British were convinced that Razmara was the Jason who could deliver to them their golden fleece. Razmara was easily one of the most erudite officers in the Iranian military. He had by 1950 published dozens of books on matters relating to geography, cartography, and military strategy. He was also an avid memoirist, leaving behind detailed accounts of his travels and encounters. He was a man of infinite political ambition and considerable guile. But it proved hard to convince the Shah to offer full support to the ambitious general. The Shah was not alone in worrying about Razmara's ambitions. The British government, arguably his most ardent advocate, worried that he might be tempted to act across constitutional processes and move against the Shah. But the situation was so serious that the risk, according to the British, was deemed well worth taking. The Shah was certainly less sanguine about such risks as they threatened his throne. For a while, he had resisted the Razmara appointment by claiming he had not been certain about the British attitude towards such a move. When on June 19, 1950, the British reiterated their full report for the Razmara appointment, the Shah had said disingenuously that he was relieved to hear this. Ultimately, he had even to ascend. Ultimately, he even had to accede to British and American demands that he should go out of his way to demonstrate he was supporting Razmara. Before taking the final leap, the Shah sent Ernest Perron to the British embassy to tell them categorically that once Razmara was appointed Prime Minister, he would be allowed to have any say in military affairs. He would not be allowed to have any say in military affairs. While the Shah worried about Razmara's ambition, the new Prime Minister had oil on his mind. He knew he had a formidable enemy in Mossadegh, and he also knew his survival depended on his ability to solve the oil crisis. He wanted to forge an agreement that was acceptable to Britain and palatable to the people of Iran, whose nationalist sentiments had been aroused by Mossadegh. Razmara tried to convince the nation that nationalization was not in Iran's best interest. He hired an American advisor to argue that nationalization was not a wise decision for Iran. He even argued that Iran was simply incapable of managing its oil industry. We can't even build the handle of an ewer, he infamously said in a speech before the Parliament. He had envisioned a series of grandiose reforms, from decentralization of the government to dismissing corrupt government officials, and hoped to see them to win the hearts and minds of the people. He tried to pressure the Shah to decrease the military budget and allow the use of those sums for social reforms. He had also asked the U.S. and British governments for loans and aid for implementing these badly needed changes. More than once, Razmara told the British that, should they desire to provide Iran with any foreign assistance, they should make it clear that it could not be used for unnecessary things such as airplanes. Clearly, he and the Shah did not see eye to eye on budgetary matters. As arguments between the two men ensued, the Shah complained to the British embassy that activity against the Shah was being carried out by Razmara, or at any rate the people in his confidence. The British dismissed these complaints and considered them the result of the Shah's jealousy and mistrust. At the same time, they believed that the Shah had begun to oppose Razmara through the Majlis a week after his ministry began. The plot thickened considerably when, in the heat of Razmara's battles with the Majlis, the Shah agreed to allow Ayatollah Kashani to return to Iran after a brief period of exile. Whisper had it that the Shah's primary intention was to have the cantankerous Ayatollah weaken the ambitious general. If indeed that was his intent, the ploy worked. Almost immediately, Kashani became one of Razmara's most forceful enemies. He declared it the duty of every Iranian to oppose the government. Mossadegh and his allies used even stronger language in their attacks on the general. Some went so far as to compare him with Hitler. The Shah's relationship with his prime minister was further complicated by the fact that his twin sister, Princess Ashraf, was having an affair with the dashing officer. Both were married at that time, yet their letters, published in recent years, clearly indicate an intimate, intensely amorous relationship. He calls her "my kind beloved." Aziz e me Rabbanim. The addresses her using the informer singular, you, in Persian, to, while she calls him "my dear General." General e Azizim. When she complains of his fickle ways, saying that he had forgotten her during one of his trips, he defends himself by saying that he had sent every day a telegram. Every day I have written you a note. The letters also show Ashraf's fervent attempt to keep her general in her brother's camp. It might, she says, be God's will that my brother will have his commands and ideals materialized by you. Razmara believed he had trumped all the Shah's machinations against him when he convinced the British government to agree to what was close to a 50-50 profit-sharing agreement. He told the Majlis that he wanted to deliver an important speech and intimated that the final resolution of the oil crisis was now at hand. On March 7, 1951, however, as he was tried to enter a mosque in the center of Tehran, an Islamist terrorist, a devotee of Kashani's, met him with 3 bullets. Not long after he was taken to the hospital, he was declared dead. Rumors of the Shah's hand in the assassination began to spread immediately. Razmara had been reluctant to go to the mosque that day, but Asadollah Alam, the Shah's closest confidant, had repeatedly urged him to go. Alam was in fact questioned by the police after the assassination. All these facts added poignantly to the rumors. The assassin, as it turned out, was a member of the Fedayeen-e-Islam. The general's assassination paved the way for the passage of the Oil Nationalization Act and for Mossadegh's rise to the pinnacle of power. The Shah's murky attitude toward nationalization was evident when he appointed Hussein Allah to replace Razmara. Soon after the appointment, Allah met with British officials who told him to ask the Shah to use all his influence to persuade deputies under his control to stay away from the Majlis, and thus render a quorum impossible. This had become the last British weapon to abort the nationalization bill. Alam told them that 43 of the Majlis, 131 deputies, known to be allied with the Shah, would stay away. At the same time, Allah, the new Prime Minister, told British officials that all Persians regard nationalization as a desirable principle. In early February 1951, as the movement to nationalize oil was gathering steam, the Shah told officials of the British embassy that he was in a rather melancholy mood. He was worried that the Majlis might pass the nationalization bill, and he would be left with no choice but to dissolve the parliament. The Shah listened to the historic March 15 proceedings of the Majlis discussing the nationalization bill on the radio, and then told British officials that he regretted that it had not been possible to arrest the movement which the National Front had inaugurated towards nationalization. He wanted the British government to know that by regularly intervening on the behalf of such issues as oil, the purchase of locomotives, and the contract to fix Tehran's water supply, he had risked being regarded as unpatriotic by his somewhat Byzantine-minded officials. The British respected the Shah of double talk, if not double cross, when nearly every member of the Majlis, deemed close to him, showed up for the historic March 15 vote to ratify the nationalization bill. The Nationalization Act had been shepherded through the Majlis by Mossadegh. It was by then clear that his hour of glory was near. A month later, on April 26, he accepted the nomination to become Prime Minister on the condition that the bill to implement the Nationalization Act should be simultaneously ratified. The nomination was made by Jalal Imami, a member of the Majlis known for his close ties with the Shah. Some have surmised that Imami made the nomination on the assumption that Mossadegh would not accept it. The Tudeh party saw it as yet another troubling sign of the increasing influence of American imperialism in Iran. The Shah in 1951 was walking a very dangerous tightrope. The British were pressuring him to dissolve the Majlis, declare martial law, and nullify the Nationalization Act. They insisted that he must appoint Saeed Zia as prime minister, and they implicitly threatened that unless he followed their demands, they would not discourage a campaign against certain of the Shah's prerogatives by some of the non-communist opponents of Mossadegh. The meaning of the threat was not lost on the Shah. He knew well that it meant that unless he agreed to the British demand, Saeed Zia would once again go on the attack against him. To his credit, the Shah resisted these pressures, while at the same time revealing himself in private, particularly with the British, to be an opponent of the nationalization movement. But in those heady days, the Shah's views, along with his mood, had violent swings. The more Mossadegh gained power and popularity, and the more he succeeded in marginalizing the Shah from the daily political life of the country, the more the Shah became determined to get rid of him. Yet he was at the same time increasingly beset with indecision and inaction, what the Western diplomat called his Hamlet-like doubts and paralysis. He wanted senators and members of the Majlis to take responsibility for Mossadegh's dismissal. He believed that he should bide his time and wait for the moment at which Mossadegh would further isolate himself. He also believed that the only way that he could be involved in getting rid of Mossadegh was through legal channels. As early as May 1950, he had concluded that there were two enemies of the country. One was the Tudeh, and the other was the National Front. Perhaps the later was more dangerous, he said, because it was vague and negative. When the British ploy to pressure the Shah into fast action on the dismissal of Mossadegh did not work, officials from Whitehall consulted Anne Lambton, by then a professor of Persian studies in London, and a sage on British foreign policy in Iran. Her advice was clear, categorical, and drastic. Find a way to remove Mossadegh from power forcefully. He is a demagogue, she said, and the only way Britain would retain its influence in Iran would be through his removal. She also believed that the British government must ultimately handle this matter alone, as in her mind the United States had neither the experience nor the psychological depth to understand Iran, a sentiment much shared in those days by British officials. She introduced government officials to Robin Zainer, a professor spy who could help plan and implement her proposed coup against Mossadegh. If Zainer was one of the British masters of conspiracy against Mossadegh, then the three Rashidian brothers were Zafir's chiefs, instruments of mischief. No sooner had Mossadegh come to power than the brothers began to receive large funds from the British to maintain their agents. In June 1951, when British efforts to convince the Shah to fire Mossadegh failed, they threatened to attack Iran and take over the oil region of the country. In the words of the Foreign Secretary, to cow the insolent natives. The operation, aptly called Buchanan, entailed sending a number of British warships to the waters off the coast of the oil-rich region of Khuzestan and authorized the use of force, if necessary. Encouraged by the Truman administration's strong opposition to the idea of military solution, the Shah told the British ambassador that I will personally lead my soldiers into battle against you if you attack Iran. The Shah also had another worry. In the July 2, 1951 meeting, the Shah asked about a recent debate on Iran in the House of Commons and the suggestion by Churchill's son-in-law that there should be a partition of Persia between Russia and Britain. The Shah noted that he could not see how in such a case the Persians could refrain from resisting, adding moreover that in his view Russia would install a communist government for the whole of Persia. the British even considered the idea of bringing back the Khazars family, who had virtually ruled Khuzestan in the early 20th century, and again making that region an independent area under the family's ostensible rule. Once the United States was officially briefed on the possibility of a British military attack, when the State Department was given a summary of the cabinet meeting authorizing it, the administration went all out to convince Britain to give up its Operation Buchanan. Truman sent a note to Prime Minister Clement Attlee, telling him not to use force but to try to find a negotiated solution to the problem. Secretary of State Dean Acheson and Assistant Secretary George McGee also tried to dissuade the British. The temptation to engage in what Churchill had churlishly called the sputter of musketry was at least partially based on the facile assumption that a decadent, servile nation like Persia was inherently incapable of launching, much less sustaining, a serious, sustained anti-colonial nationalist movement. Mossadegh and his movement, in the jaundiced vision, were nothing but a passing aberration. Mossadegh was a madman, the British believed, and the Iranians as a people too fickle and selfish to remain loyal to him. Britain even toyed with the idea of getting NATO involved in its plan to find a military solution to the conflict. At the same time, while the Truman administration was holding the line against a military strike on Iran, it was also beginning to worry about Mossadegh's future, the possibility that under Tudeh-party pressure, he might push Iran away from the West and either toward neutrality or, worse yet, into the Soviet camp. As early as May 10, 1951, these fears were evident in Acheson's telegram to the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. Both Mossadegh and the Shah were playing the same card with the Truman and later the Eisenhower administrations, each presenting himself as the last line of defense against the Tudeh and Soviet influence. Mossadegh went so far as to ask for $10 million a month in financial assistance from the United States. He threatened that unless he received the aid, Iran would collapse within 30 days and the Tudeh would take over. He even tried to blackmail the United States by saying that if U.S. will not give him the aid, then he would be forced to ask for Soviet assistance. The Shah, on the other hand, repeatedly argued that Mossadegh did not have the power or even the desire to resist the Tudeh. During the early days of Mossadegh's tenure, the Shah even suspected Ayatollah Kashani, in these days Mossadegh's most important ally, of complicity with the Tudeh and the Soviet Union. On August 30, 1951, for example, the Shah told the American ambassador that his government had intercepted communications between Kashani and the Russians. Kashani might be looking in the direction of collaboration with the Soviets. The fact that, as Mossadegh became more isolated from the clergy, he was reluctantly forced to depend more and more on the Tudeh party helped the Shah make his case. As the two leaders played out their strategies, their relations grew tenser by the day. On July 16, 1952, in a heated meeting with the Shah, Mossadegh demanded full control of the armed forces, threatening to resign and to tell the nation the reason for his resignation, should the Shah refuse to grant him his demand. "If I cede the control of the army," the Shah said, "I might as well pack my bags and leave the country." The threat, in Mossadegh's mind, was only a tactical move as indignation of the popular prime minister. He was wrong. Late that night, the Shah accepted Mossadegh's resignation. The next day, after the Majlis' vote of inclination in favor of Kavam, the Shah had no choice but to once again appoint his septuagenarian foe to the post of Prime Minister. 4 months he had resisted such an appointment. Now, under pressure from the British and American embassies, and from some of his own supporters, he had no choice but to give in. Kazim made 2 demands of the Shah before he would accept the job. The first was for the Shah to dissolve the Majlis, and the second was to allow the arrest of Kashani. The Shah refused both demands, but Kazim nonetheless accepted the task of forming a new government. It is clear that the Shah neither trusted Kazim nor was willing to sever ties with Kashani. In the words of the British Embassy, these ideas led to the Shah's decision not to fully support Kazim. The fact that Kazim then filled his cabinet with figures known to oppose the Shah further clouded his already tenuous relations with the Shah. On the night of the appointment, the Shah let it be known, particularly to the leaders of the National Front, that he had appointed Kazim under duress. What further weakened Kazim's position and chance of survival was his notoriously hard-nosed first manifesto. There is a new sheriff in town, he said, and he would tolerate no dissent. A powerful coalition of Kashani and Mossadegh supporters, as well as members of the Tudeh party, was formed against Kazim. On the morning of July 21st, Kazim again tried to persuade the Shah to take the measures to establish law and order. Once again, the Shah refused. On that same day, the British ambassador had tried to not only play on the Shah's fears, but make him realize that it is by letting Kazim down that he is most likely to bring his own downfall. Lest the Shah still worry about Kazim's designs on the throne, the British ambassador tried to reassure him that no such efforts would be forthcoming. But it was all to no avail. By 5 o'clock in the afternoon of that day, massive demonstrations in Tehran and other provinces, leaving dozens dead and hundreds injured, forced Kazim's resignation and the reappointment of Mossadegh. The Shah had defeated one foe only to face a far more powerful adversary yet again. Though Ayatollah Kashani had played a key role in restoring Mossadegh to power on that day, he also wanted to keep his options open. A few months earlier, he had sent out feelers to both the American embassy and the Shah. For example, on January 8, 1952, Zainer, who was working in Tehran at the time, reported rumors that the Shah had achieved a clear understanding with Kashani. A few months later, Kashani in fact met directly with Court Minister Allah, and after offering faint praise for Mossadegh, discussed candidates to succeed him. Convinced that he had restored Mossadegh to power in the months after July 21st, Kashani became even more brazen in dictating policy to the government. He wanted women to be forced to wear Islamic covering when entering government offices. He demanded the right to name certain ministers and veto others. Finally, he wanted the government to increase pressure on the Baha'i, a 19th century faith. Finally, he wanted the government to increase pressure on the Baha'i, a 19th century faith that emerged from Iran, and whose followers became the bane of Shiite clergy. Mossadegh resisted nearly every one of Kashani's demands. The only issue he relented on was women's suffrage. When in 1952 he was drafting a new election law, women's groups from around the country had written to him, objecting to the omission of the women's rights to vote in the new law. Soon a rumor spread around the country that Mossadegh was contemplating including women's suffrage in the new law. A number of top clergy wrote to Mossadegh or issued fatwas, suggesting that women's participation in politics was against Islam and sure to beget corruption. Moreover, Mossadegh's increased ties with the Tudeh and the rising star of National Front radicals like Hussein Fatemi, by then the foreign minister, made the clergy in general, and Kashani in particular, more concerned. These tensions all worked to the benefit of the Shah. In fact, in meeting with the British embassy, the Shah's close aide, Ernest Perron, tried to claim that the advent and evolution of these rifts were the work of the Shah, and the result of his astute politics. In the meantime, lest he appear to be conspiring with the British, on March 4, 1952, the Shah informed the embassy that henceforth any meetings between him and embassy officials should go through the foreign ministry. During these crucial months, the Shah's most constant companion, and in her own reckoning, the person who repeatedly brought him out of his torpor and urged him to screw his courage to the sticking point, was a 16-year-old half-Persian, half-German girl whose ignorance of Iranian politics and history was matched only by her beauty and her love of Hollywood glamour. Soraya, many believe, was the true love of the Shah's life. The trajectory of his love objects, his elective affinities, and the character and qualities of each of his three wives are in fact telling signposts of his evolving personality and his core values and preferences. If his first wife was chosen by his father's royal fiat, his second, Soraya, was chosen by his mother and sister Shams. They had picked her from a picture, and Princess Shams was then dispatched to Europe to get a closer look at this exotic beauty. As Soraya makes amply clear in her refreshingly candid memoir, by the time of her betrothal, intense competition among the female members of the Shah's family, his sisters, and his domineering mother was at a fever pitch. The privilege of picking a new queen was a coveted prize they all fought over. After Shams met and approved Soraya, her picture was shown to the Shah, who was immediately smitten. She was half Persian by blood, but profoundly European in sentiment and values. Her mother was German, and her father was a member of the Bakhtiari tribe. Strange spelling. Bakhtiyyari. Bakhtiyyari. Batiara tribe. As a child of Isfahan, she had been tutored by a German woman referred to as Frau Mental, and then moved to the Behestes Iron School. Even as a child, she showed interest in playing the role of Queen in the school's production of Cinderella. According to the British consulate in Isfahan, her departure from that city was the result of the unrequited love and unrelenting pursuit of a man, a son of Seram al-Dawleh, one of the most powerful aristocrats in the city, leading to her parents' decision to take refuge to Switzerland. Her stay in Europe might account partly for her shocking disdain for Iran, her remarkable ignorance of its history and culture, and her infatuation with the noble Europe of her imagination. In her personal memoir, she writes, "I was a dunce. I knew next to nothing of the geography, the legends of my country, nothing of its history, nothing of Muslim religion." Her upbringing at the hand of Frau Mental was entirely Christian and German. That was why, when the news of a royal wedding spread, some mullahs are said to have criticized the marriage to a half-European girl mainly brought up in Europe. According to British officials, this feeling may be quite widespread. Her description of her own identity is revealing enough. The feeling of being both Christian and Muslim, but at the same time of being neither the one nor the other, has engraved in my flesh two divergent poles between which my existence has unfolded. The one is methodically European, the other savagely Persian. She describes her daily life in Tehran by referring to visits to hospitals, orphanages, charities, the people's quarters with their dijobs open to the sky with the streams of dirt water, which supplied their dwellings, having first served washerwomen, tramps, and dogs, poverty and squalor, children with rickets, ravaged women and starving old men, the filth of the alleyways, where the houses are no longer like houses, where poverty, real poverty, prevailed. On the other hand, Paris dazzled her, and anywhere in Europe. Every day my heart was filled with sunshine. Life was light. When she went to school in Europe, it was wonderful to be able to go to cinema, to drink a glass of lemonade on the terrace of a brasserie, a paradise hitherto forbidden. In Persian schools, she found gray uniform, the stove which smoked and poisoned the classroom, lessons, homework, work to the point of exhaustion, even caviar, a delicacy she clearly loved, and tried to add to the court's regular culinary menu, was in her mind one of the fragrances of the West. Yet when the Shah saw and approved the picture, and after Soria went on a shopping spree with Shams, the two returned to Tehran on October 7, 1950. For Soria, this was a homecoming after a 5-year absence. Before long, at the Shah's insistence, arrangements began for a second royal wedding, and the official announcement was made on October 9th. The news was most jubilantly received by her Bakhtiyari family in Isfahan and to British officials. This was a cause of concern as, in their view, most, though not all, of the family are an idle opium-smoking lot, and the court may soon be infested with a swarm of them. The announcement of Soraya's engagement included a lie. She was in fact 16 years old at the time, but in the official announcement she was credited with 18. The difference in age might have appeared excessive. The Shah was nearly 31 years old. In reality, for traditional men of Iran at the time, such a difference would hardly seem excessive, but it bothered the Shah. Initially, the wedding had been planned to take place just after Christmas, and elaborate preparations for nearly a week of festivities had been made. But Soraya fell ill on October 26th. She was examined by some of the best physicians in the country, but only one, the Shah's private physician, Dr. Ayadi, correctly diagnosed her as suffering from a case of salmonella poisoning. There had been, at the time, an epidemic of this disease in Tehran. Eventually, based on the feeling that expensive entertainments were not in accord with the spirit of the times, plans for an elaborate wedding were scuttled in favor of more simple arrangements. Even the simple wedding was badly botched. Someone had printed and distributed a large number of fraudulent invitations, and many more guests than anticipated showed up for the ceremonies. There were rumors of sabotage. Soraya herself was so weak by the time of the ceremonies that she virtually passed out halfway through the wedding. But by February 13th, she was the Queen of Iran. A few weeks after the wedding, the Shah planned a trip to Jordan, where, in the words of the British Embassy officials, the young, air-minded monarch was planning to pilot a plane but at his disposal by the British Air Force. But on April 1st, 1951, during a lunch meeting with the British ambassador, the Shah confided that he was suffering from appendicitis and had been advised that he should be operated on soon. He said he was on a strict diet, that he had been in bed for the last few days, and that he was thinking of going to France or Switzerland for the operation. In those days, Hussein Allah was in charge of what was clearly a caretaker government following the assassination of General Razmara. The British Embassy wanted to know whether the Shah thought Allah could successfully resolve the oil issue. The Shah refused to give a definitive answer, but said he had asked Allah for a definitive statement whether he could solve the oil question or not. As he waited for a clear indication of Allah's position, the Shah's health deteriorated. On April 10th, he sent Asadullah Alam to see the British ambassador and say that the Shah sought the British Embassy's advice on whether he should go to Europe for the operation or have it in Iran. The ambassador, after saying that the Shah's health was the first consideration, suggested that a specialist be brought in. In an eerie foreshadowing of events in 1978, one Dr. Faulkner, who had visited the Shah when he was visiting America, was brought in under the strictest secrecy. He performed the appendectomy on the Shah on the July 5, 1951, and decided that no other operation was necessary. While the operation forced the Shah to cancel his Jordan trip, he had decided, even before his illness, to reject the offer of flying the British plane lest it might be embarrassing in view of the present propaganda against British influence here. Nevertheless, the Shah did give a Rolls-Royce to Soraya as a wedding gift. A Rolls-Royce with special accessories provided by H.J. Milani. He had first ordered the car 2 years earlier, but various problems had delayed delivery. It was a special model of which only one has so far been built. On a smaller scale, the country's political turmoil was replicated in the Shah's private life. Soraya describes in a bitter tone how the Shah banned from court Furo Zafar, the woman she most trusted and called aunt. The charge was seditious activities. In her view, the entire episode was nothing but a conspiracy hatched entirely by the Shah's mother and his sister Shams. Those were the days of the Shah's confrontation with Mossadegh, the days of anxiety about bugged rooms and spies, double agents, and unreliable allies. At the same time, descriptions of the royal couple's favorite pastimes are fascinating. Aside from poker, where Soraya was a mere observer, they played parlor games like charades and telephone. Masked balls were also a favorite activity. In one held in late 1953, Mohammad Reza decided royalty demanded it to disguise himself as a lion. She describes how she was, as a result of a conspiracy, thwarted in her effort to appear as Madame de Pompadour. Instead, she was forced to wear a Joan of Arc breastplate. Her description of the Shah in this period is mostly positive. She often praises him when she finds European characteristics in his behavior, Oriental traits are invariably cause for disparagement. She appreciated his timid tenderness in his relations with women. Despite a first marriage, she writes, and in spite of countless mistresses he had had before me, Mohammad Reza was extremely shy with women. He did not like to show his feelings. His eyes, however, were expressive, dark brown, almost black, shining at times, hard at times, sad or gentle. They exuded charm and reflected his soul. At the same time, he found that he could not bear the smallest rebuke. Aside from the Shah's mother and siblings, there was another source of tension between Soraya and the Shah, and that was Ernest Perron. How can I, she writes with bitterness, describe this chatoun, in brackets, piece of shit? This limping devil who dragged his leg and spread his poison around the palace, as well as in our own quarters. He was, she says, a homosexual who detested women, all women. She found him to be cunning, perfidious, and Machiavellian. He roused hatred, stirred up gossip, reveled in every intrigue. She writes of the Shah's fascination with this diabolical Swiss, who claimed to be a philosopher, a poet, and a prophet. She writes of how every morning the Shah would shut himself up in his room with Perron and talk about affairs of state or gather some piece of information which the shaitan had been able to glean in the bazaar. She had to throw him out of the room when one day he lewdly set about asking questions concerning my life with Mohammad Reza. In these trying times, Soraya attempted to bring some joy to life on court evenings by having the Shah listen to Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Sidney Becquet, Count Basie, and Sarah Vaughan. But it was all to no avail. The Shah looked somber and distressed, and he remained taciturn. He even stopped playing poker with his friends at night. Rumor had it that the Shah oftentimes played high-stakes games at court, sometimes with a couple of 100,000 tumen, about 70,000 changing hands. The Shah was said to be reticent about receiving or writing checks at the end of the game. Though he enjoyed these poker games immensely, he quit playing. He believed his phones and his rooms were bugged. He no longer laughed at their jests or played parlor games organized to divert him. With her characteristic candor, Soraya even writes of their embrace in the nuptial bed, and how it was invariably to console him. About the same time, the British Foreign Office concluded that the Shah appeared on the verge of a nervous breakdown. As Mossadegh's confrontation with the British continued, and as his relations with the Shah grew more and more strained, the Shah's mood deteriorated even further. He was becoming increasingly tense and worried. He continued to go to his office every day, but it was merely a formality. Nobody asked for his advice. More than once he complained to Western diplomats that the current state of affairs was untenable for him. By April 1953, he succumbed to Mossadegh's demand and dismissed his loyal court minister, Hussein Allah, and allowed the prime minister to name Abolghasem Amini in his place. By then, visits to the Shah by politicians were deemed by Mossadegh to be an unfriendly gesture. Ministers were banned altogether from making any such visits. The Shah Nadir was reached when even the commanders of the military were barred, on the orders of Mossadegh, from giving him reports. As Mossadegh had demonstrated in the aftermath of his July 21, 1952, confrontation with the Shah, in his mind, the Shah's constitutional title of Commander-in-Chief was no more than a perfunctory formality. The Shah, on the other hand, saw his constitutional role as commander-in-chief as a pillar of his power and a license to micromanage the military. Even after he had succumbed to Mossadegh's demand and allowed him to take over the command of the military, the Shah tried to continue his control of the armed forces through the secret officers group that had come to exist in the aftermath of the Second World War. As his power dissipated, the Shah began to pay ever more attention to every gesture of those he met lest they show any sign of disrespect. In Soraya's view, he began to distort every remark, to see an affront or an assault behind every word and gesture. He felt, in her words, like a hunted animal. At night, he would sleep with a revolver under his pillow and repeatedly changed his room. In one meeting with the American ambassador, late in 1951, he made no effort to hide his great anxiety. He declared again and again in seeming despair, "But what can I do? I am helpless." He went on to say, "No matter how strong and resolute I may wish to be, I cannot take unconstitutional moves against strong current nationalist feelings." He asserted that Mossadegh's policies are leading Iran towards ruin, but then asked, "What slogans have I to change this time? Can I appeal to balanced budgets?" A few months later, the Shah sent Alam to see the British ambassador to reassure him that the Shah was fully aware of the danger of keeping Mossadegh in power, and that he was determined to get rid of him. The power was that he felt completely alone. The problem was that he felt completely alone and thought if he took action against Mossadegh, no one would support him. More importantly still, he believed that a secret hand was supporting Mossadegh, and that this secret hand, in the king's mind, was the American government. To give a sense of the country's mood, the Shah recounted to one British official how on the same day of their meeting he had received emissary with the message from Ayatollah Boroujerdi stating that all Iran must stand together in face of British threat. He concluded the meeting by saying at present he did not know where to run. The reference to Boroujerdi was particularly poignant as a matter of principle. Boroujerdi rarely entered the political arena directly. Just as his clear support for Mossadegh at the time was for the Shah a sobering indication of his foe's power, so too when Boroujerdi and others in the clerical establishment ended their support for Mossadegh and aligned themselves with the Shah and his supporters in early 1953, that change of heart was a harbinger of the Shah's rising star and the sign that Mossadegh's base of power was weakening. More than once in those days, British and American officials complained that the Shah is lacking in courage and in resolution. Loy Henderson, the American ambassador, for example, said that while the Shah was conscious of his weakness, he was nevertheless inclined to conceal his true character by finding excuses for inaction and even laying blame for past mistakes on those around him. For this reason, as early as July 31st, 1952, Henderson concluded that if a coup against Mossadegh was to be successful, it had to be carried out and executed by Iranian army in the name of the Shah without knowledge of Shah, since Shah would probably not have stamina to see it through and might at certain stage weaken and denounce leaders. During those months, the Shah's behavior at times bordered on the fatalistic. He often engaged in his passion for speed. He sometimes drove one of his many fast cars to Kalardast, his favorite vacation spot near the Caspian coast. A British embassy official described one such trip. The Shah drove 80 miles an hour in his Packard convertible. The narrow, curvy two-lane road to Kalardasht, the Kalas Road, was in those days a notorious death trap. Even the venue in which he would hold sensitive conversations reflected his haunted mood. When discussing plans to topple Mossadegh or choosing who would replace him to obtain maximum privacy, the meetings took place in Palace Gardens. Kermit Kim Roosevelt, the CIA operative who went to Iran to arrange for the fall of Mossadegh, offers startling accounts of his crucial early August 1953 meetings with the Shah. A strange brew reminiscent of a Le Carre novel made into a bad Hollywood movie. Around midnight on Saturday, August the 1st, Roosevelt describes crawling into the back seat of a suitably unroyal car, a blanket covering him as he huddled down on the floor. As they entered the royal palace gates, security was lax. By then, Mossadegh had substantially reduced the court's budget, closed the special offices of the Shah's siblings, exiled the more active members of the royal family, particularly the Shah's twin sister and his mother, and demanded that the king give up his annual revenue from the Imam Reza Endowment, the richest religious endowment in the country at the time. Before long, the Shah's security detail and even the number of tanks that protected the palace were reduced as well. No sooner had the car neared the palace itself than the finely drawn, distinctively regal features of the Shah appeared. Roosevelt was there to convince the Shah that the United States and Britain were both behind him and supported the idea of toppling the Mossadegh government. A few weeks earlier, the Shah had demanded to know whether the British government still supported him, and on May 28th, Churchill had asked the U.S. government to convey to the Shah his personal message, that is, that Britain should be very sorry to see the Shah lose his power or leave his post or be driven out. The United States, too, declared its support for a move against Mossadegh. Now Roosevelt was there to talk tactics and strategy. They walked in the garden in the dark of night. Roosevelt promised that the United States would confirm its earnest support of the project by having President Eisenhower confirm this himself by a phrase in a speech he is about to deliver in San Francisco. Britain would reassert its commitment through a specific change made in the announcement on the BBC broadcast the next night. Personal note on the Shah's wanting to know if he still had British support. Churchill's comment I find here is just amazing, or his message. That Britain should be very sorry to see the Shah lose his powers or leave his post or be driven out. It doesn't really talk about them supporting the Shah. It more or less says they don't want the Shah replaced by that shit. You know what I mean? It's kind of like they still, it doesn't really suggest full support. It's brilliant. Anyway, with tensions between the Shah and Mossadegh mounting, on February 19, 1953, Hussein Allah, the Minister of Court, received a call from Mossadegh asking him to send a responsible representative from the court to take a personal message from the Prime Minister to the Shah. Mossadegh was increasingly using health excuses not to go to meet with the Shah. The same reason, as well as his fear of assassination, was given for moving the Prime Minister's office to his private home, where he conducted many of his official meetings in bed, in his pajamas. In the meeting with the court representative, Mossadegh, in the presence of three of his closest aides and allies, briskly requested emissary to tell the Shah that he could no longer tolerate unfriendly attitude of Shah and court, and that on February 24th he would submit his resignation. He accused the Shah of intriguing against him, and maintained that the court was engaged in all manner of conspiracy, all intended to bring about his fall. It was a dangerous gambit by Mossadegh, intended to force the Shah to either totally submit to him or leave the country. This was a move sure to alarm the American government as well as Mossadegh's more moderate supporters, since both were opposed to the idea of regime change. Keeping the U.S. government on his side remained, up until the night of August 18, 1953, high on Mossadegh's agenda. But he was banking on the idea that under the prevailing circumstances, the Shah could not afford to be seen as playing any role in the demise of the Prime Minister. Ever since his victory in the showdown with the Shah in July 1952, Mossadegh had acted as if he was impervious to any action from the Shah, as if he knew that the king would never dare dismiss him. The emissary, as well as Mossadegh's allies, all asked the Prime Minister to reconsider. He was, however, adamant. The Shah was deeply distraught when he heard the message and asked Allah to intervene. The court minister, too, found the Prime Minister intractable. Amongst Mossadegh's charges against the Shah, the strangest was that of the Shah had supported Kazim against him. In reality, the Shah had been much against the idea of Kazim's appointment. Moreover, the appointment had come only after the Parliament had shown its inclination towards Kazim. By law, after such a vote, the Shah had no choice but to appoint Kazim. Implicit in Mossadegh's complaint was that any move to support another candidate for Prime Minister was itself treason. Many of his aides and closest advisers made this claim much more openly. Mossadegh also criticized the Shah's decision to divide some of the crown lands among tenants. He had said the Shah should turn lands over to the government and allow it to determine their disposition. He seemed to believe that the Shah's move was a publicity stunt meant to undermine the government. In reality, belief in the necessity of a land reform had been part of the Shah's vision as soon as he ascended the throne. In fact, as early as April 1950, the Shah had told the British ambassador that land reform was a must in Iran and that he would begin with the crown lands. He went on to say that landlords were terrified at the prospect of land reform and were, in some cases, working up the mullahs into a counterattack on the ground that such a movement would be against the religion of Islam. The Shah's words proved prescient in about a decade when he did in fact launch land reform. Precisely such an alliance between the clergy and the landlords was formed to fight the Shah. In that February 19, 1953 meeting, Mossadegh also accused the Shah of encouraging the uprising amongst the Batiyari tribes against the government. Allah defended the Shah, arguing that he was firm in his belief that Mossadegh should remain as Prime Minister, as he was better qualified than anyone to effect a solution to the oil crisis. When the Shah was told of Mossadegh's intractable position, he asked Allah to inform the American embassy of the problem and to continue negotiating with Mossadegh. He also relayed the message to Mossadegh that he was prepared to leave the country and to stay abroad until Mossadegh requested his return. The Prime Minister responded that, in his view, the Shah should not leave the country. Neither Allah nor the Shah believed him on this point. They both believed that the ultimate goal of Mossadegh's most recent threat of resignation was in fact to force the Shah's exit from the country. The American embassy, too, concurred, believing that Mossadegh intended to use the feeling of euphoria in the country about an imminent solution to the oil problem to crush his political enemies and settle his score with the Shah. Concurrent with his offer to Mossadegh to leave the country, the Shah also began to think about a possible replacement for Mossadegh, should he indeed carry out his threat and resign. For some time, his favorite candidate had been Alayar Selah, an eminent leader of the National Front. In May 1951, the Shah, in fact, had had a long talk with Selah, and had been more favorably impressed than ever. Selah, at least, according to the Shah, had been quite critical of Mossadegh and had expressed complete devotion to Shah. Ultimately, the Shah's efforts to create a fissure between leaders of the National Front, particularly between Mossadegh and Selah, failed. He had more success when it came to increasing the rifts within the nationalization movement in general. Within 20 hours of the meeting between Mossadegh and his emissary, the Shah was searching for a means of getting message to Selah, while at the same time re-emphasizing his opposition to General Fazollah Zahidi. Aside from Selah's own attitude, the other obstacle to such an appointment was that the American State Department had pronounced themselves as totally favorable to any idea that Alayar Selah should be successor to Mossadegh. A showdown between Mossadegh and the Shah now seemed inevitable. On the morning of February 24th, Mossadegh went to the court and met with the Shah. Less than 12 hours earlier, shortly before midnight, Ayla had met with Henderson at the American ambassador's residence and indicated that Mossadegh had promised not to press his grievances against the Shah, at least for the time being. The Shah had met with a delegation of deputies allied with Mossadegh and promised them that he would make it clear once and for all that officers in the armed forces must look to Mossadegh, not Shah, for instructions. He also agreed not to meet with persons known to be critical of Mossadegh. On the issue of land distribution, he refused to agree with Mossadegh's demand. What made the Shah's position more complicated was that later in the same day he received a message from some leading members of the Majlis, including some erstwhile supporters of Mossadegh, asking him not to seek reconciliation with Mossadegh. They assured the Shah that should Mossadegh attack him, the majority of Majlis and country would be outraged and support Shah. Concurrent with his offer to Mossadegh to leave the country, the Shah also began to think about a possible replacement for Mossadegh should he indeed carry out his threat and resign. For some time, his favorite candidate had been Alayar Selah, an eminent leader of the National Front. In May 1951, the Shah, in fact, had had a long talk with Selah and had been more favorably impressed than ever. Selah, at least, according to the Shah, had been quite critical. Okay, I'm repeating the reading. Sorry about that, but I'll just carry on. Had been quite critical of Mossadegh and had expressed complete devotion to Shah. Ultimately, the Shah's efforts to create a fissure between the leaders of the National Front, particularly between Mossadegh and Selah, failed. On the morning of February 24th, Mossadegh went to the court and met with the Shah. Less than 12 hours earlier, shortly before midnight, Ayla had met with Henderson and the American ambassador's residence, and indicated that Mossadegh had promised not to press his grievances against the Shah, at least for the time being. Okay, moving ahead. In those days, a group of 8 Majlis deputies, In those days, a group of 8 Majlis deputies, divided more or less equally between supporters of the Shah and supporters of Mossadegh, had been busy meeting with the two sides, hoping to heal the rift between the two men, and to find a modus operandi, wherein realities of the time and mandates of the Constitution were both considered and implemented. Ultimately, the group of 8's efforts came to naught. Not only did Mossadegh and the Shah have starkly different understandings of the Constitution, but there was also a powerful external actor named Great Britain, who did not favor an amicable resolution to the standoff. Moreover, by the time the group had arrived at a preliminary resolution, Mozaffar Beghi, one of the leaders responsible for creating the group, indicated that he was opposed to its implementation, as it would afford Mossadegh too much power. On the night of February 27, a distraught Ayla told Loy Henderson that the Shah was planning to leave the country and had insisted on keeping his travel plans a secret, lest there be attempts to prevent his departure. Ayla talked of the Shah's almost hysterical state, adding that he feared complete nervous breakdown and irrational action. Ayla also detailed the Shah's plans to leave in a car the next day around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, accompanied by the Queen, 2 servants, and some guards. He had asked Mossadegh for 40,000 for 2 months' living expenses, and additional 10,000 for the initial cost of travel, and his help in securing an official invitation for the royal couple from some foreign government. He meant to go first to Iraq, and from there travel to Spain or Switzerland. Mossadegh had, according to Ayla, given his word of honor to the Shah that during his absence he would do nothing to undermine the Shah, and the Shah believed Mossadegh Ali was sure this was just a ruse by Mossadegh, and that there would be no return should the Shah leave the country. He wanted the United States to use all its influence to deter the Shah from such a trip. But, as Ayla repeated more than once, the Shah himself was anxious to leave. It was in this labyrinthine context that the February 24 meeting between Mossadegh and the Shah took place. Not surprisingly, it was anything but conciliatory. Mossadegh had apparently changed his mind about the wisdom of the Shah's continued stay in the country. He was now convinced that it might be a good idea after all for the Shah to leave the country as soon as possible and to remain abroad until the situation of the country became more stable. The Shah knew all too well that precisely such a temporary trip abroad had ended the reign of not just Ahmad Shah, but of Qajar dynasty. The Shah's suspicion about Mossadegh's motives and plans was only increased when, in earlier discussions about the composition of the Regency Council, which would nominally head the government during the king's absence, Mossadegh had insisted on passing over the Shah's only full brother, Ali Reza, in favor of another half-brother, Ghulam Reza. By law, the latter was forbidden from ascending the throne after the Shah, and thus Mossadegh was clearly forcing out of the regency the only brother who could succeed the Shah in case his foreign sojourn turned into permanent exile. On the morning of February 28th, according to the U.S. Embassy, whispers of the Shah's imminent departure swept the city. There is much evidence to indicate that not only the court, through Ayla, but Kavam, Ayatollah Bey Bahani, an influential cleric in Tehran, and Ayatollah Kashani had all become active in mustering forces that would converge on the court and try to pressure the Shah to reconsider. It was rumored that Mossadegh had threatened the Shah, and that unless he left of his own volition, Mossadegh would have no choice but to ask the people to choose between the Shah and himself. The night before the Shah's rumored departure, at a dinner hosted by an American embassy official, the guests included a number of bizarre merchants and few political personalities. All guests, with the exception of Khosrow Khan Gash Gahai, believed the Shah's departure would be detrimental to the interest of the country. By the morning of the 28th, the embassy, along with the whole litany of de facto allies, including Kashani, were openly trying to effect the cancellation or least postponement of the Shah's plan to leave. The most serious obstacle to the success of this coalition's effort came from the Shah himself. When the American ambassador tried to engage the Shah in a conversation about the wisdom of his staying in the country, he received an evasive answer. The Shah, in Henderson's view, was now a nervous wreck, had jumped at the chance of escaping, and thus could not be dissuaded from leaving. But events of that day surprised the Shah. At 11 o'clock on the morning of February 28, not long before Mossadegh's arrival for what they both thought would be a farewell lunch, Ayla met with the Shah to try for the last time to persuade him not to leave. But the Shah was not deterred. "If I don't go," he said, Mossadegh would issue a proclamation attacking me and members of my family. He did not, he said, want to engage in a squabble with Mossadegh. In the course of the meeting, news reached Ayla and the Shah that Ayatollah Kashani was convening an emergency meeting of the Majlis, which 57 members present, to discuss ways to convince the Shah not to leave the country. When the Shah received this news, he had become excited, not because it was a sign of popular support for him or because it indicated a crucial breach between Mossadegh and his key ally, Kashani, but because such developments might stop his departure. He insisted on leaving at once. Before lunch, in fact, the day before, a car carrying some of the royal couple's personal belongings had already left the capital. Heavy snow impeded the car's progress. Before long, another messenger arrived from the Majlis, reporting that a secret session of the Parliament had passed a resolution indicating that the Shah's departure at this time would not be advisable. Moreover, General Baharmest from the Joint Chiefs of Staff was said to be en route to the court to inform the Shah that the whole General Staff had decided to resign in case Shah should leave the country. Even that was not enough to deter the Shah. Only when a large crowd of people demonstrated for the Shah near the court during the Shah's meeting with Mossadegh did he change his mind about leaving the country. In that crowd, standing nervously atop the high wall that separated the court compound from the outside world, was an agitated young man named Ardashir Zahidi. "I hate heights," he said, "but somehow I found myself on the wall, leading the crowds in their chants and slogans." The meeting between Mossadegh and the Shah was tense to begin with, but when the gathered crowd began to chant increasingly violent slogans, including the demand for Mossadegh's death, the meeting came to an abrupt end. Soraya claims that she tried to calm a clearly agitated, perspiring, and deathly pale Mossadegh, and showed him how to leave the court through the back door, thus avoiding the beleaguered crowd. But at home, too, an angry crowd awaited Mossadegh, when, according to the American embassy, he appeared on the balcony of his famous pajamas in an effort to quiet the throng. He was booed down. Throughout the day, loudspeakers were calling on people, "If they are for Shah, now is time to demonstrate the fact." After the show of popular support, the boyhood Shah was once again resolved to stay and fight on. The American embassy assessed that the institution of the crown may have more popular backing than expected. They also noted that Kashani has shown more power than expected both in influencing the Majlis and in quickly marshalling for mob action his fanatical followers. The British, on the other hand, saw the Shah as a pawn in the power struggle between Kashani and Mossadegh. That was why British officials did not take much comfort in the show of support for the Shah that day, as it was, in their view, certainly organized by Kashani and was not a spontaneous expression of loyalty deep-seated or significant enough to stiffen the Shah. Nevertheless, at 9 o'clock on the night of February 28th, the Shah broadcast a message over the radio that embodied his new spirit. He said, "As I informed the public, my communiqué issued by court on advice of my physician, it was necessary for me to go abroad for a pilgrimage and a medical treatment for a short time, as all day today, and in fact at the very moment, while I am speaking to you, I have witnessed the sincere feelings of the people. I gave up the idea of going on this trip, and I expect the patriotic and valiant people of Iran in all parts of the country to maintain order, so that, by the help of the Almighty, Iran may continue along the path of honor." Lest there be any doubt about who had managed to bring the crowds out into the streets, Ayatollah Kashani also issued a statement appealing to all to collaborate with the clergy to prevent the Shah from going on a trip that would have led to agitation in the country. Mossadegh was particularly unhappy about the role he believed the United States had played in stopping the Shah from leaving the country. Shortly after his ill-fated meeting with the Shah, Mossadegh met with Henderson. He was in a bad mood, apparently suffering from severe headache. Henderson tried to convince Mossadegh to cease his attempts to get rid of the Shah, but Mossadegh contemptuously referred to those at the court demonstrating against him and those in the Parliament passing a resolution in favor of the Shah as British agents. On other occasions, he called the demonstrators hoodlums, criminals, agitators, and foreign agents. To Henderson, he confirmed that he had gone to the court to bid the Shah farewell. He was convinced that he could not constitute necessary reform and obtain resolution of of oil problem so long as courts served as basis of operation of British agents. On March 2nd, Mossadegh met Henderson again and asked him to order all American citizens to keep off the streets. When Henderson retorted that the safety of American citizens was the responsibility of the government, Mossadegh responded by accusing the United States of interfering in Iran's domestic affairs and suggested that the Americans had played a key role in dissuading the Shah from leaving the country. The Shah, on the other hand, remained calm and resolute in his decision to stay in Iran. He met a delegation of Majlis deputies and told them he had done nothing reprehensible and that the people had already spoken in his favor. At the same time, a few days later, Mossadegh and a couple of his supporters confronted the Shah about the events of February 28, accusing him of laying a trap for Mossadegh. They claimed that the Shah had supposedly suggested he wanted to leave the country, but organized demonstrations in his own support and against Mossadegh. The Shah, at least according to Mossadegh's supporters, responded rather meekly. "We do not want to do anything above and beyond the Constitution, and we do not wish to interfere in matters that are not within the purview of the King. And if some people have used the occasion of my trip to unsavory ends, the government must prosecute them fully." For Mossadegh, events of that February were a fiasco. For the Shah, they were a watershed event. Clearly, the balance of forces hitherto in favor of Mossadegh was beginning to change in the Shah's favor. Mossadegh had not only made his move against the Shah and failed, but more crucially, his failure emboldened his foes, augmented the Shah's power, revived the King's sagging resolve, and increased tensions between Mossadegh and the American government. The once despondent Shah, who had been tormented by an increasingly somber and defeatist attitude, was now in a much better, more self-assured fighting spirit. Though he was an astute politician, Mossadegh still failed to realize the importance of his failed February move. On March 3rd, representatives of the Prime Minister and the Shah were both summoned to Qom by Ayatollah Boroujerdi, where they were given identical letters. The epistle ended with what must have been for Mossadegh an ominous hint and for the Shah a promising sign. The Ayatollah, until then a clear supporter of Mossadegh, this time asked him and the Shah to preserve your unity and collaboration as before and thus prevent disorder and insecurity in the country. In the tumultuous meeting in the Majlis in the days after the February 28 meeting, Royalists criticized Mossadegh in sharp terms for not telling the Parliament about the Shah's projected trip. Mossadegh refused to accept any blame, instead referring to certain provocative activities against the government emanating from Shah's entourage. He complained that people broke into his house, and I was compelled to climb a ladder in my pajamas and run away to the American Assistance Organization Point 4 office. Mossadegh ended his evasive retort by divulging his plans to hold the referendum. Almost a week before the public announcement, Mossadegh had told Henderson, the American ambassador, that he might have a plebiscite throughout the country. Mossadegh supporters congregating in one mosque and his opponents in another. During the same conversation, Mossadegh also articulated his theory of power, wherein lay the roots of his defiance toward the Shah and toward the Majlis, a theory that came into direct conflict with the fundamentals of representative democracy. He was not, he told Henderson, the Prime Minister of the Shah or the Prime Minister of the Majlis, but the Prime Minister of the people. He repeated much the same idea when he spoke to a jubilant crowd of supporters outside the Majlis. "My real Majlis," he said, "is here with you." Supporters have often praised these pronouncements as a laudable sign of Mossadegh's democratic beliefs. In fact, they are the naked pronouncements of a populist exhibiting a clear disregard for the checks and balances that define representative democracy and differentiate it from the rule of the mob. The idea of a referendum turned out to be surprisingly controversial. Abul Hassan Hayar Azadeh, once a key ally of the National Front, accused Mossadegh of being a worse dictator than Reza Shah, and lambasted the idea of a referendum as the work of a rebel government. Other critics used the media to attack the idea of the referendum. By then, a propaganda war against Mossadegh, some of it funded by the CIA's BADAMN operation, was in full force. A dubious idea like the referendum, and an even more dubious exercise of forcing government opponents to cast their ballots in separate voting stations, became perfect ammunition for this campaign. Another favorite weapon was Mossadegh's continued insistence that he must be given special powers to govern. He demanded and received from a pliant Majlis the power to legislate. Even some of his allies began to see these powers as excessive and despotic. By early March, Tehran was preparing to hold the referendum, and the city was awash with rumors about a new clash between the Shah and his increasingly embittered yet still ambitious prime minister. The ultimate goal of the referendum was also not clear. The apparent purpose was to decide whether the parliament should be dissolved. In 1949, the Constituent Assembly had given his power to the Shah. He had refused to use it against Mossadegh, particularly when the British pressured him to dissolve the Majlis, dismiss the Prime Minister, and nullify the Nationalization of Oil Act. Now Mossadegh was keen on using a referendum to dissolve a parliament elected during his own government's tenure. The Shah and the American embassy saw the referendum as yet another sign of Mossadegh's steady move in an authoritarian direction, and in using the technique of mobocracy. The Shah and some of his supporters, as well as nearly all of Mossadegh's more radical allies and supporters, also saw it as the first necessary step in ending monarchy in Iran. The referendum further split the ranks of the movement to nationalize oil. Ayatollah Kashani was openly and belligerently against the idea of a referendum, and of Mossadegh himself. Other critics and foes of Mossadegh, from Mozaffar Baghai and General Fazollah Zahidi to Ayatollah Borujerdi and Ayatollah Belbahani, were now openly working to topple the government. The more isolated Mossadegh became, the more he had to rely on the Tudeh party and the most radical members of the National Front. The more radical his camp became, the more united his foes became, and the more they came to enjoy the sport of the British and American governments. As he admitted in later years, Ayatollah Khomeini had told his mentor Kashani in 1953 that Mossadegh was an infidel and did not deserve the support of the clergy or of the Muslim nation of Iran. By the time of the referendum, officers deemed more loyal to the Shah than to Mossadegh were increasingly forced to retire and were at times even arrested. This resulted in what the American embassy called the continuous, surreptitious discussion of a military coup d'etat by Shah loyalists. The brutal execution of General Mohammad Afshartas, the chief of police, and a staunch Mossadegh supporter, whose badly tortured body was found outside Tehran on April 14th, only added to the air of menace and confrontation in the country. Sensational allegations that many of the royalists were complicit in the murder, from Baghai and General Zahedi to the Shah himself, only added to the tension. The Shah sent secret messages to the Mossadegh opposition in the Majlis and other groups loyal to him, asking for their continued support and explaining that, if he has so far been passive, it is only because of his belief that he is not yet in a position openly to resist Mossadegh. The embassy officer reporting this message was incredulous, adding that it is difficult to believe that the Shah would really have the necessary courage or resolution. At the same time, it was increasingly clear that General Zahedi was emerging as the only man capable of standing up to the popular and populist Mossadegh. The fact that the general had been given a surprisingly sympathetic reception by the Majlis when he sought asylum there against Mossadegh's attempt to arrest him further, convinced both the British and American governments that he was the man to replace Mossadegh. The main obstacle to the general was the fact he was not able to obtain support of Shah. Gradually, the Shah's options for finding a moderate leader to take the place of Mossadegh dwindled. After he lost hope in Alayar Salah for a few days, he tried to convince the new Speaker of the Majlis, Abdullah Moazzami, to accept the post. He too was unwilling to move against Mossadegh. When the referendum did take place on March 3rd, according to government sources, in Tehran alone, 1.5 million people voted in favor and only 20 against the resolution to dissolve the parliament. The Shah believed that in the absence of the Majlis, he had the constitutional authority to dismiss Mossadegh. Although Mossadegh had bet that the Shah would never dare use this power, and although Mossadegh had most of his supporters have argued since 1953 that the Shah in fact had no legal authority to dismiss Mossadegh even during parliamentary recess, both historical precedents and Mossadegh's own writings indicate otherwise. First of all, there had been at least 14 recess appointments of prime ministers when there was no parliament in session. Mossadegh not only knew this well, but had often spoken favorably of Ahmad Shah, the king who had made these appointments. More crucially yet, in a hitherto surprisingly overlooked letter, Mossadegh himself, as late as October 1948, confirmed that the Shah had the right to make such appointments. At that time, he and a group of opposition figures, what in fact became the embryo of the future National Front, had organized a sit-in at the court to object to what they considered a clumsily stolen election. Mossadegh wrote a letter to Court Minister Abul Hussein Hajar, soon to be assassinated by Islamist terrorists close to Kashani, in which he wrote, "His Majesty is of course the source of all reforms, and the main reason for our sit-in is that in the period of parliamentary recess, Fetrat in brackets, when the appointment of his prime minister does not require a vote of inclination by the Majlis, we hope His Majesty can appoint a governor whose goal is to preserve the interest of the monarchy and the nation." In other words, absent a parliament, the Shah does have the right to dismiss a prime minister. The referendum thus put into place the last piece of the puzzle that has since come to be known as Operation Ajax.